In a Philadelphia courtroom, as the 110-year sentence was pronounced upon the youngest defendant ever tried as an adult for killing a police officer, Kane Jones's face remained as emotionless as it had been when he pulled the trigger. What drove a 12-year-old boy to commit such a calculated act of violence against Officer James Wilson had baffled investigators until they discovered the child's journal hidden beneath his mattress. The chilling, methodical entries detailing his fantasy of killing a cop would reveal a disturbing truth. Behind the face of a child lurked something experts would call an irreparably damaged mind. Officer James Wilson was shot 3 times at point-blank range during what should have been a routine traffic stop in North Philadelphia. The shooter was not the driver he had pulled over for running a red light, but rather the driver's younger brother, 12-year-old Kane Jones, who had been sitting quietly in the back seat before suddenly producing a .38 caliber handgun. The bullets struck Officer Wilson in the neck and chest, leaving him no chance of survival as he collapsed on the rain-slicked asphalt of Kensington Avenue, his blood mixing with puddles reflecting the harsh glow of streetlights. This shocking murder, committed by a child not yet in his teens, would send ripples of disbelief through Philadelphia, a city already hardened by decades of crime and violence. The evening had begun unremarkably, with Officer Wilson working his regular evening patrol in Philadelphia's tough Kensington neighborhood, an area known for its open-air drug markets and frequent violent crime. He had radioed in a traffic stop at approximately 9:45 in the evening, noting a sedan with a broken taillight that had just run a red light at the intersection of Kensington and Allegheny Avenues. The dash cam from his patrol car would later show a seemingly routine interaction, with Officer Wilson approaching the driver's side window with the standard caution taught in police academy, but displaying no particular alarm. What the camera would also capture, in stark and horrifying detail, was the moment when a small figure lunged forward from the shadows of the back seat, arm extended, followed by 3 distinct muzzle flashes that illuminated the interior of the car. The driver, later identified as 19-year-old Marcus Jones, initially fled the scene in panic, leaving his younger brother Kane behind with the fallen officer. Surveillance footage from a convenience store across the street captured the surreal image of a small boy standing over the body of Officer Wilson, still holding the smoking handgun, before calmly walking away from the scene. The child made no attempt to run, instead walking at a measured pace for nearly 6 blocks through the rain-soaked streets of Philadelphia, the murder weapon still clutched it in his small hand. When patrol officers responding to the "Officer Down" call finally spotted him wandering near Huntington Park, Kane Jones surrendered without resistance, his only words being, "I did what I came to do." The killing sent immediate shockwaves through Philadelphia's closely knit law enforcement community, with officers flooding the area around Temple University Hospital, where their fallen comrade had been pronounced dead upon arrival. Outside the hospital, a spontaneous vigil formed, with blue lights illuminating the tear-stained faces of fellow officers, many of whom had worked alongside Wilson during his 15 years on the force. The thin blue line had been struck at its heart, not by a hardened criminal or gang member, but by a child young enough to still be in elementary school. As dawn broke over the city of brotherly love, residents awoke to headlines that seemed impossible to comprehend. A 12-year-old boy had executed a police officer, and the question on everyone's lips was simply, why? The Jones family home in the Strawberry Mansion neighborhood became an instant focal point for investigators seeking to understand how a child could commit such a calculated act of violence. Inside the modest row house, detectives discovered a bedroom that offered troubling insights into young Kane's mindset. Posters depicting graphic violence covered the walls, while a collection of notebooks contained detailed drawings of police officers being shot, stabbed, and otherwise assaulted. Each illustration displayed a technical precision unusual for a child of 12, with anatomical details suggesting Cain had researched how to inflict maximum damage with his attacks. The notebooks also contained written entries expressing a deep hatred for law enforcement, with repeated phrases like, "Cops deserve to die," and "I'll be famous when I kill one," appearing throughout the pages. Marcus Jones, the older brother who had been driving the car, was located and arrested at a friend's apartment just hours after the shooting. During his initial questioning, he broke down in tears, claiming he had no idea his younger brother had brought a gun into the vehicle or harbored any intention to harm the officer. "He was just supposed to be coming with me to get food," Marcus repeated through sobs as detectives pressed him about his brother's apparent preparation for the crime. The weapon, Marcus eventually admitted, had been purchased illegally by him several months earlier for protection in their dangerous neighborhood, but he insisted he had kept it hidden in his bedroom closet. How Cain had obtained the gun remained unclear, though investigators suspected the older brother's negligence had made the deadly weapon accessible to the child. The community response to the killing revealed the complex relationship between Philadelphia residents and the police force that served them. In Kensington, where the shooting occurred, residents placed flowers and candles at a makeshift memorial for Officer Wilson, many expressing disbelief that such a well-respected officer had met such a violent end. Yet in other parts of the city, particularly in predominantly African-American neighborhoods with histories of tense police relations, reactions were more complicated. Some community leaders expressed sympathy for the officer while simultaneously questioning how the justice system would treat a white 12-year-old compared to a black child of the same age. This racial dimension would become an undercurrent throughout the case, though Cain's age remained the most shocking and discussed aspect of the crime. The weapon used in the killing, a Smith & Wesson .38 special revolver, contained Cain's fingerprints on both the grip and trigger, eliminating any doubt about who had pulled the trigger. Ballistics confirmed that all 3 bullets recovered from Officer Wilson's body had been fired from this weapon, with the fatal shot entering through the neck just below the jawline, severing the carotid artery. The medical examiner's report described the shooting as execution style, noting the close range and precision of the shots, particularly unusual given the shooter's young age and presumed lack of firearms training. This precision would later factor heavily into the prosecution's argument that the killing was not an impulsive act, but rather a carefully planned assassination, calling into question conventional wisdom about juvenile crimes being acts of impulse rather than calculation. Philadelphia's history with juvenile crime had seen many tragic chapters, from the crack epidemic of the 1980s to the gang violence that plagued certain neighborhoods in more recent decades. Yet even veteran officers and prosecutors struggled to recall a case involving such a young perpetrator committing such a deliberate and violent act against law enforcement. The city that had weathered countless storms of urban violence now faced an unprecedented situation that challenged existing frameworks for understanding juvenile crime and punishment. As the investigation unfolded in the days following the shooting, the question evolved from simply why to the more complex issue of how the justice system should respond to a crime so adult in its execution, yet committed by a child whose age would, under normal circumstances, place him in the juvenile justice system rather than adult criminal court. Officer James Wilson had dedicated 15 years of his life to serving the Philadelphia Police Department with distinction and compassion that earned him respect from both fellow officers and community members alike. Rising through the ranks from a patrol officer to a community liaison specializing in youth outreach, Wilson had made it his personal mission to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the city's vulnerable young people. His personnel file contained numerous commendations, including 3 citations for bravery after he rushed into a burning building to save a family in 2016, and his instrumental role in establishing a police athletic league in Kensington that gave neighborhood kids an alternative to the streets. Friends and colleagues described him as the model of what a modern police officer should be. Firm but fair, authoritative but approachable, and always mindful that behind every crime was a human story that deserved to be understood rather than simply punished. At 41 years old, James Wilson had balanced his demanding career with a rich family life centered around his wife Angela, a nurse at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and their 3 children, 16-year-old Michael, 14-year-old Sarah, and 10-year-old David. Their home in the northeast Philadelphia neighborhood of Mayfair was known for its open-door policy, where Wilson often invited rookie officers for Sunday dinners to impart his philosophy of community policing, while Angela served her famous pot roast. Wilson coached his son's baseball teams and never missed Sarah's dance recitals, somehow managing the difficult task of being fully present for his family despite the unpredictable demands of police work. Angela would later tell the court that on the morning of his death, James had kissed her goodbye, as always, promising to bring home ice cream for a family movie night, a simple domestic plan that underscored the ordinary goodness that defined his life before it was violently cut short. The son of a factory worker and a school lunch lady from South Philadelphia, Wilson had grown up understanding the struggles of the city's working-class residents. His childhood in the shadow of the Navy Yard had exposed him to the realities of economic hardship, which gave him unusual empathy for the communities he would later police. After graduating from South Philadelphia High School, he had briefly worked construction before enrolling in the police academy at 26, motivated by a desire to help revitalize neighborhoods like the one where he'd grown up. His academy instructors remembered him as an exceptional cadet who excelled not just in tactical training, but in the ethical dimensions of law enforcement, consistently emphasizing de-escalation over confrontation and communication over force. Officer Wilson's greatest legacy, however, may have been his work with at-risk youth, making the circumstances of his death at the hands of a 12-year-old all the more tragic and ironic. He had pioneered a program called Badges and Books, which brought police officers into elementary schools to read with students, breaking down barriers between children and law enforcement from an early age. The program had expanded to 35 Philadelphia schools under his guidance, with measurable improvements in both students' reading scores and their attitudes toward police. Wilson had often told colleagues that reaching children before negative influences could shape their perceptions was the key to building safer communities in the future. If we wait until they're teenagers to try and connect, we've already lost most of them, he was known to say, a philosophy that made Kane Jones's act of violence feel like a devastating rebuttal to everything Wilson had worked to achieve. The funeral for Officer James Wilson transformed Philadelphia's Cathedral Basilica of Saints Peter and Paul into a sea of blue uniforms, with over 2,000 officers from departments across the country coming to pay their respects. Mayor Patricia Chen delivered a eulogy that captured the city's collective grief, describing Wilson as a guardian in the truest sense, someone who protected not just our safety, but our hope for a better Philadelphia. Outside the cathedral, thousands of citizens lined the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, many holding handmade signs thanking Wilson for his service, while a police helicopter performed a solemn flyover. The funeral procession stretched for nearly 2 miles as it made its way to the cemetery, with residents standing in silent tribute on sidewalks and overpasses along the route. The city's flags remained at half-staff for a week, a visible reminder of the collective loss felt across Philadelphia's diverse neighborhoods. Among the mourners most deeply affected were the children from Wilson's youth programs, many of whom attended the funeral wearing their police athletic league jerseys with black armbands. 12-year-old Darnell Jackson, who had participated in Wilson's reading program since second grade, read a poem he had written titled Officer Friend, describing how Wilson had helped him overcome his fear of police and inspired his own dream of becoming an officer. Several teenagers from Kensington credited Wilson with keeping them away from gangs and drugs, with one 18-year-old telling reporters, "Officer Wilson believed in me when nobody else did, not even me." These testimonials painted a portrait of a man whose impact extended far beyond his official duties, touching hundreds of young lives at their most vulnerable and formative moments. Angela Wilson's victim impact statement, later read at Kane Jones's sentencing hearing, gave the court a glimpse into the private anguish behind the public tragedy. She described midnight panic attacks and the challenge of helping her children process their father's violent death while managing her own grief. "My youngest son now sleeps with his father's badge under his pillow, believing somehow it will protect him from the monsters he now knows exist in the world," she told the hushed courtroom. Her words gave human dimension to the statistical reality of a life cut short. 40 years of potential future happiness erased, 3 children who would navigate adolescence without their father's guidance, and countless future at-risk youth who would never benefit from James Wilson's mentorship. The loss extended beyond one family to encompass an entire city, deprived of a public servant whose approach to policing emphasized healing community divisions rather than enforcing distinctions. Fellow officers from Wilson's precinct established a memorial scholarship in his name, awarded annually to a Philadelphia high school graduate pursuing studies in criminal justice or social work. The first recipient was a young woman from Kensington who had participated in Wilson's youth program and planned to become a juvenile probation officer to help troubled teens like Kane Jones. At the scholarship presentation ceremony, Police Commissioner Robert Garcia announced plans for a new training module based on Wilson's community engagement methods that would become mandatory for all Philadelphia officers. James believed that effective policing isn't about force or fear, but about genuine connection with the communities we serve, Garcia said, his voice breaking with emotion. That philosophy will now shape our department for generations to come. The investigation into Officer Wilson's murder revealed that he had encountered Kane Jones on at least 2 occasions prior to the fatal shooting, though there was no evidence that the boy harbored any personal grudge against Wilson specifically. School records showed that Wilson had visited Kane's 5th grade class as part of the Badges and Books program, and later that same year, Wilson had responded to a domestic disturbance call at the Jones home, where he had handled the situation with characteristic professionalism and restraint. The random nature of the encounter that led to Wilson's death, a routine traffic stop with no indication of danger, underscored the vulnerability that officers face every day, never knowing which seemingly ordinary interaction might turn deadly. This sobering reality prompted an immediate review of traffic stop procedures within the department, though experts acknowledged that no policy could fully protect against the element of unpredictable human behavior. In the months following Wilson's death, his widow Angela emerged as an unexpected advocate for juvenile justice reform, arguing that while her husband's killer must face consequences, the system needed to better identify and intervene when children showed early warning signs of violence. James would want us to ask why a 12-year-old had so much hate in his heart, not just how severely we can punish him, she told the Philadelphia Inquirer in an interview that generated considerable controversy. Her nuanced position, simultaneously honoring her husband's memory while refusing to demonize his juvenile killer, reflected the complex moral questions at the heart of the case. Angela's perspective would later influence the establishment of the James Wilson Early Intervention Initiative, a program designed to identify and provide intensive support to elementary school children exhibiting dangerous behavioral patterns before they escalate to violence. The first 911 call, reporting an officer down, came at 9:47 in the evening, the caller's voice tense with panic as he described seeing a police officer collapse during a traffic stop on Kensington Avenue. Within seconds, additional calls flooded the emergency dispatch center, including one from a convenience store clerk who reported witnessing a kid, maybe 10 or 11 years old, shooting a cop multiple times before walking away like nothing happened. Dispatch immediately issued an "officer down, shots fired" alert, the highest priority call in police communications, sending every available unit racing toward the scene with sirens wailing through the rain-soaked streets of Philadelphia. The first responding officers arrived 3 minutes and 27 seconds after the initial call, finding Officer James Wilson lying motionless beside his patrol car, his uniform already soaked with blood despite the efforts of a bystander, a former military medic, who had rushed to apply pressure to the neck wound. The crime scene quickly transformed into a hub of frantic activity as patrol officers established a perimeter while paramedics worked desperately to stabilize Wilson for transport. Detective Michael Anderson, a 17-year veteran of the homicide unit who'd been having dinner just 4 blocks away when the call came in, arrived on scene before the ambulance had even departed. His practiced eye immediately noted several crucial details. The position of Wilson's body suggested he had been facing his attacker directly when shot. His service weapon remained holstered, indicating he had perceived no threat requiring him to draw it, and the absence of shell casings pointed to the likely use of a revolver rather than a semi-automatic pistol. As rain continued to fall, potentially compromising evidence, Anderson ordered the immediate deployment of tarpaulins over the scene while officers began the systematic canvass for witnesses, many of whom had already disappeared into the neighborhood's shadowy side streets, reluctant to become involved in a police investigation. The most valuable piece of evidence retrieved from the scene came from Officer Wilson himself, whose body camera had captured the entire encounter in high-definition video and audio. The footage, downloaded immediately at Temple University Hospital while medical staff pronounced Wilson dead at 10:14 p.m., provided investigators with a clear sequence of events that would become central to the prosecution's case. In the video, Wilson could be seen approaching the driver's side of a gray 4-door sedan, his movements relaxed but alert, as he asked the driver, later identified as 19-year-old Marcus Jones, for license and registration. The interaction appeared routine until Wilson leaned slightly forward to examine the documents, at which point a small figure lunged forward from the back seat, arm extended, the muzzle flash momentarily overexposing the camera's sensor before the video showed Wilson staggering backward, his hand moving toward but never reaching his service weapon before he collapsed. The convenience store's surveillance system provided crucial additional footage, capturing the aftermath as the sedan initially pulled away from the scene before stopping abruptly about 50 feet down Kensington Avenue. The driver fled on foot heading east, while the camera clearly showed a child-sized figure exiting the rear passenger door, walking back to where Officer Wilson lay, and firing 2 more shots at close range before calmly walking away westbound on Kensington Avenue. This surveillance video, combined with the officer's body camera footage, gave investigators an unambiguous visual record of both the initial shooting and the subsequent execution-style shots that followed. Detective Anderson would later testify that in his entire career investigating homicides, he had rarely encountered evidence so clear and definitive, stating, "There was no question about what happened or who did it. The only mystery was why." The search for the young shooter mobilized every available officer in Philadelphia's East Division, with particular focus on the child's likely path of travel based on the last known sighting near Huntington Park. K-9 units were deployed to track the suspect's scent, while the department's helicopter unit used thermal imaging to search for anyone hiding in the neighborhood's numerous abandoned buildings and vacant lots. At 11:23 p.m., just under 2 hours after the shooting, Officer Regina Hayes spotted a child matching the suspect's description sitting alone on a swing in a playground 3 blocks from the crime scene, the revolver still visible in his hand. Using exceptional restraint given the circumstances, Hayes coordinated with her partner to approach from different angles, calling out to the boy with firm but calm commands to place the weapon on the ground and raise his hands. The arrest of 12-year-old Kane Jones occurred without further violence, though officers at the scene were struck by the child's eerie composure as he was taken into custody. Despite the gravity of the situation, he displayed none of the fear, remorse, or even excitement that might be expected from a child who had just committed a capital crime. He was completely flat emotionally, Officer Hayes would later report. When I told him he was under arrest for killing a police officer, he just nodded like I'd told him dinner was ready. This affective flatness would become a recurring theme in observations of Kane throughout the investigation and subsequent trial, raising troubling questions about his psychological state. Due to his age, specialized juvenile officers were immediately called to the scene to handle his processing, and a critical decision was made to videotape all interactions with the suspect from the moment of his arrest, a precaution that would later prove invaluable in countering defense claims of coercion or manipulation. The murder weapon recovered at the time of arrest was identified as a Smith & Wesson model 1038 special revolver with the serial number partially filed off. Forensic analysis would later confirm that Kane's fingerprints were the only ones present on the trigger and grip, while his brother Marcus's prints appeared on the cylinder and barrel, suggesting he had handled the weapon but had not fired it during the incident. The gun contained 5 spent cartridges and 1 live round, consistent with the 3 shots captured on video and suggesting 2 additional shots may have been fired either before or after the recorded sequence. Ballistics tests confirmed that all 3 bullets recovered from Officer Wilson's body had been fired from this revolver, with the fatal shot entering his neck at an upward angle that severed his carotid artery, causing rapid and irreversible blood loss that would have rendered survival virtually impossible, even with immediate medical intervention. While Kane Jones was being processed at the juvenile detention facility, a parallel operation was underway to locate his brother Marcus, who had fled the scene immediately after the shooting. Using the vehicle registration information obtained from the traffic stop, detectives identified the Jones family residence in the Strawberry Mansion neighborhood and deployed a tactical team to the location at 11:45 p.m. Though Marcus was not present, officers secured the residence as a secondary crime scene and began a systematic search that yielded disturbing evidence. In Kane's bedroom, investigators discovered dozens of hand-drawn pictures depicting violence against police officers, journals containing fantasies of shooting cops, and a collection of newspaper clippings about officers killed in the line of duty. Most troubling was a crudely drawn map of Kensington Avenue with several locations marked "good spot for cop killing," suggesting a level of premeditation that contradicted any notion of the shooting as a spontaneous act. Marcus Jones was eventually located and arrested at a friend's apartment at 2:17 a.m., approximately 4.5 hours after the shooting. Initially claiming no knowledge of his brother's intentions, Marcus's story began to unravel during interrogation, as detectives presented him with evidence that contradicted his account. He eventually admitted to knowing that Kane had taken the illegal handgun Marcus had purchased for protection, but insisted he had no idea his brother planned to use it against a police officer during their drive through Kensington. "He just said he wanted to come with me to get food," Marcus repeated through tears. "I never thought he would do something like this." Charged as an accessory after the fact and with illegal possession of a firearm, Marcus provided critical information about his brother's increasingly violent behavior in the months leading up to the shooting, including Cain's obsessive viewing of online videos showing violence against police and his stated desire to become famous by killing a cop. By dawn of the day following the shooting, investigators had assembled the basic framework of what had occurred, but the why remained elusive, despite the mountain of physical evidence and video recordings. Detective Michael Anderson, leading the investigation, requested an emergency psychological evaluation of Cain Jones, hoping to gain insight into the child's mental state and motivations. Child psychologist Dr. Elaine Mercer conducted a preliminary assessment at the juvenile detention facility, later describing her findings as deeply concerning. Though limited by both time constraints and Cain's general unresponsiveness, Dr. Mercer documented his lack of emotional reaction when discussing the killing, his inability to express empathy for Officer Wilson or his family, and his apparent pride in having accomplished his mission. Her initial report, while cautioning against premature diagnosis, noted patterns consistent with conduct disorder with callous, unemotional traits, a childhood precursor to antisocial personality disorder that is characterized by a profound lack of empathy and remorse. As the sun rose over Philadelphia the morning after Officer Wilson's murder, the city awakened to news headlines that seemed almost unbelievable. 12-year-old executes Philly cop during traffic stop. The police commissioner held an early press conference on the steps of police headquarters, his face grave as he confirmed the basic facts of the case while asking the public to respect the ongoing investigation. Behind the scenes, the district attorney's office had already begun the complicated process of determining how to charge a 12-year-old suspect in such an extraordinary case. Pennsylvania law permitted children as young as 10 to be tried as adults for murder, but such decisions typically involved careful consideration of multiple factors, including the nature of the crime, the defendant's background, and the potential for rehabilitation within the juvenile system. The deliberate execution of a police officer by a preteen suspect presented an unprecedented challenge to the juvenile justice system, forcing prosecutors to balance punitive justice with the recognition of diminished culpability inherent in extreme youth. The initial profile of Cain Jones that emerged from the investigation painted a disturbing picture of a child whose path to violence had been marked by numerous warning signs that had gone either unnoticed or unaddressed. Born to Jessica and Robert Jones in 2011, Cain had experienced significant instability during his formative years, with his father incarcerated for armed robbery when Cain was just 4 years old, and his mother struggling with addiction issues that frequently left Cain and his older brother Marcus in the care of their maternal grandmother, Elaine Jones. School records obtained by investigators revealed that Cain had been flagged by teachers as early as first grade for concerning behaviors, including torturing insects on the playground, expressing fascination with weapons and violence, and showing a notable lack of emotional response when disciplined or when witnessing other children in distress. These early indicators of potential conduct disorder had resulted in multiple referrals to school counselors, but limited resources and his family's inconsistent follow-through meant that Cain never received the comprehensive psychological evaluation or treatment that might have altered his trajectory. By the time Cain reached 5th grade, his behavioral issues had escalated significantly, with 3 suspensions for fighting, an incident where he brought a knife to school, and increasingly explicit violent fantasies shared in creative writing assignments that alarmed his teachers. One particular essay recovered from his school records, written when he was 11 years old, described in disturbing detail how he would make the world better by eliminating cops because they are the real criminals who get away with hurting people. His fifth-grade teacher, Ms. Rebecca Daniels, had documented her concerns in multiple emails to the school principal and district social worker, writing in one message that Kane's detachment from normal emotional responses and his preoccupation with violence against authority figures suggests a level of psychological disturbance that requires immediate professional intervention. Despite these explicit warnings, budget constraints at the chronically underfunded Philadelphia Public School had resulted in only minimal intervention, occasional sessions with an overworked school counselor rather than the intensive psychiatric treatment that his behaviors warranted. Interviews with Kane's grandmother Elaine, who had become his primary caregiver after his mother entered rehab for the third time in 2022, revealed a woman overwhelmed by the responsibility of raising her troubled grandson while also working full-time as a hospital custodian. "I tried my best with that boy," she told Detective Anderson through tears during a 3-hour interview at her Strawberry Mansion row house. "But there was always something different about Kane, something cold inside him that I couldn't reach no matter how much love I gave him." She described discovering mutilated small animals in the backyard when Kane was 9, finding disturbing drawings of dead police officers hidden under his mattress, and overhearing him talking to himself about becoming famous by doing something that would shock everyone. Though she had sought help from community resources, the waiting lists for child psychiatric services were months long, and the family's limited insurance coverage presented additional barriers to accessing appropriate mental health care. The most telling insights into Kane's mindset came from the evidence recovered from his bedroom, which investigators described as a shrine to anti-police sentiment, and violent fantasies. Pinned to the walls were newspaper clippings about officers killed in the line of duty, with certain details highlighted, and notes such as "perfect execution" or "could have done better," written in the margins in childish handwriting. A notebook labeled "My Mission" contained meticulous plans for different scenarios in which he might encounter and kill a police officer, with crude but detailed drawings showing preferred target areas on a human body. Most chilling were the entries dated in the weeks leading up to Officer Wilson's murder, in which Kane had written, "Marcus drives through Kensington almost every night to get food. Cops always stopping cars there. Perfect opportunity coming soon." This level of premeditation would later become central to the prosecution's argument that despite his age, Kane had planned and executed the murder with a degree of calculation that demonstrated an adult-like understanding of his actions and their consequences. Kane's online activities, recovered from the family's shared computer and his school-issued tablet, revealed an escalating obsession with violence against authority figures, particularly police officers. His search history included hundreds of queries for terms like cop-killing videos, how to shoot someone execution style, and famous murderers who started young. He had frequented dark web forums where users shared violent fantasies, though he appeared to be primarily a lurker rather than an active participant in these communities. On a gaming platform popular with preteens, however, Kane had been more forthcoming, telling online friends in chats that he was preparing for something big and that they should watch the Philly news in the next few weeks. When one gaming friend had asked if he was serious, Kane had responded, "Deadly serious. I'm going to be more famous than any school shooter. I'm going after a bigger target." None of these online acquaintances had reported these concerning statements to authorities. Later telling investigators they had assumed Kane was just talking tough or making stuff up to seem cool. Marcus Jones's statements to investigators provided crucial context for understanding the immediate circumstances that led to Officer Wilson's murder. According to Marcus, on the evening of the shooting, Kane had asked to accompany him on a food run to a popular cheesesteak shop in Kensington, an unusual request, as the brothers rarely spent time together willingly. "He was being weirdly nice, almost excited," Marcus recalled, not realizing the sinister motivation behind his brother's sudden sociability. During the drive, Cain had allegedly asked specific questions about what happens during traffic stops and whether Marcus had ever been pulled over in that neighborhood. Questions that seemed innocuous at the time, but in retrospect, clearly indicated his preparation for the opportunity to encounter a police officer. When Officer Wilson activated his lights to pull them over for running a red light, Marcus described Cain becoming very still and focused, reaching into his waistband where he had apparently concealed the .38 revolver taken from Marcus's bedroom without his knowledge. The relationship between the Jones brothers emerged as a significant factor in the case, with Marcus occupying a complex role as both victim and enabler. Investigators learned that Marcus, though legally an adult at 19, had significant cognitive limitations resulting from fetal alcohol syndrome, functioning intellectually closer to a 14 or 15-year-old. He had dropped out of school in 10th grade and worked sporadically as a dishwasher, spending most of his time playing video games and occasionally selling marijuana to supplement his income. The illegal handgun he had purchased from a street dealer had been intended, according to his statement, for protection after he had been robbed while making a delivery for his occasional drug business. Marcus insisted he had kept the weapon hidden and had no idea Cain knew of its existence, much less that his younger brother had located it and planned to use it for murder. While Marcus portrayed himself as an unwitting accessory, other evidence suggested a more complicated dynamic between the brothers. Text messages recovered from Marcus's phone revealed that he had at times encouraged Cain's anti-police sentiments, responding to his brother's violent fantasies with messages like, "Cops deserve whatever they get," and "System needs to burn." In one exchange, 3 weeks before the shooting, when Cain had explicitly texted about wanting to take out a pig, Marcus had responded with a laughing emoji and the message, "You wild little bro," neither discouraging the violent ideation nor taking it seriously enough to alert anyone. Though Marcos maintained he never believed Cain would actually act on his violent fantasies, prosecutors would later argue that his tacit approval and failure to secure the weapon or report his brother's concerning statements made him morally, if not legally, complicit in Officer Wilson's death. Social service records revealed that the Jones family had been known to Philadelphia's Department of Human Services since Cain was a toddler, with multiple reports of neglect related to his mother's substance abuse issues. When Jessica Jones had entered her third rehabilitation program in 2022, leaving the boys in their grandmother's care, a caseworker had noted concerns about Cain's flat affect and aggressive tendencies, but had classified the placement as stable due to the grandmother's apparent commitment to providing appropriate care. The overburdened system, with caseworkers handling up to 60 families each, had conducted only 2 follow-up visits to the Jones home in the year preceding the shooting, neither of which had included a comprehensive assessment of Cain's psychological well-being or safety risks. This systemic failure to identify and address the escalating warning signs in Cain's behavior would later become a focal point for critics arguing that the tragedy represented not just an individual's terrible choices, but a collective failure of the social safety net designed to protect both vulnerable children and the communities they might harm. As a clearer picture of Cain Jones emerged through the investigation, law enforcement and prosecutors faced the difficult task of reconciling the suspect's youth with the calculated nature of his crime. Philadelphia District Attorney Maria Gonzalez convened a special assessment team including juvenile justice specialists, forensic psychologists, and senior prosecutors to evaluate whether Cain should be charged as an adult despite being only 12 years old. Pennsylvania law permitted such direct file cases for first-degree murder charges when the defendant was at least 10 years old, but such decisions were typically reserved for older teens who committed particularly heinous crimes. The execution-style murder of a police officer certainly met the threshold for severity, but Kane's extreme youth presented ethical and legal questions that divided even seasoned prosecutors within the office. The prosecution's case against Kane Jones began to take shape around three central pillars: overwhelming physical evidence, clear documentation of premeditation, and expert testimony regarding the defendant's psychological state and capacity to understand the nature and consequences of his actions. Lead prosecutor Elizabeth Martinez, a veteran of the Homicide Division with 22 years of experience, approached the case with methodical precision, knowing that the unprecedented nature of trying a 12-year-old for the first-degree murder of a police officer would place every aspect of the prosecution under intense scrutiny. Her team began by organizing the physical evidence, which included the murder weapon with Kane's fingerprints and DNA on the grip and trigger, ballistics matching the bullets recovered from Officer Wilson's body to the .38 revolver, Officer Wilson's body camera footage showing Kane firing the initial shot, and surveillance video capturing the subsequent execution-style shots delivered after the officer had already fallen. This physical evidence was, in Martinez's assessment, as close to ironclad as any prosecutor could hope for, establishing beyond any reasonable doubt that Kane Jones had indeed fired the shots that killed Officer Wilson. The more challenging aspect of building the case involved establishing premeditation, an essential element for the first-degree murder charge that prosecutors sought. Here, the evidence recovered from Kane's bedroom proved invaluable, particularly his notebook labeled "My Mission," containing detailed plans for killing a police officer that aligned precisely with the circumstances of Officer Wilson's murder. Forensic document examiners confirmed that the entries dated back several months, with the most recent entry written just 2 days before the shooting stating, "Marcus needs food from Kensington again tomorrow night. Going to bring the gun. If we get pulled over, I'll finally complete my mission." Additional evidence of premeditation came from Kane's internet search history, which showed queries for topics such as "Where is a police officer most vulnerable to gunshots?" and "How to shoot someone to ensure they die," along with maps of Philadelphia with police patrol patterns in the Kensington area highlighted. Prosecutors also recovered text messages from Kane's school tablet, showing conversations with online gaming friends where he had explicitly stated his intention to become famous by killing a cop in the weeks leading up to the murder. Perhaps the most damning evidence in establishing premeditation came from Kane's own words during his initial processing at the juvenile detention facility. Despite being informed of his Miranda rights in age-appropriate language and in the presence of a court-appointed guardian ad litem, Kane had made several spontaneous statements that were captured on the facility's audio and video recording system. When a juvenile detention officer had asked the standard intake question about whether he understood why he was being detained, Kane had responded with chilling clarity. "I killed a cop. I've been planning it for months. I wanted to see if I could do it." Later, when asked if he felt bad about what had happened, he replied, "Why would I? That's like asking if someone feels bad for winning a game they practiced hard for." These statements, while devastating to any potential defense claims of impulsivity or diminished capacity due to youth, presented prosecutors with the ethical dilemma of using a child's own unfiltered words against him, knowing that brain development research suggested 12-year-olds typically lack the impulse control and future orientation of adults. The prosecution also focused on building a comprehensive timeline of the events leading up to Officer Wilson's murder, establishing a pattern of escalating behaviors that culminated in the shooting. School records documented Kane's growing fixation on violence against police officers, including an incident 4 months before the shooting when he had submitted a creative writing assignment so disturbing that his English teacher had reported it to the principal. The essay, titled heroes and villains, had argued that police were the true villains of society, and fantasized about a world where citizens fought back by eliminating them one by one until none remain. Additional evidence came from Kane's grandmother, who reluctantly testified before the grand jury about finding a hand-drawn picture under Kane's mattress showing a figure labeled "Me" shooting a police officer, with the caption "Future Headline" written across the top. She had confronted Kane about the drawing at the time, but he had dismissed it as just a joke, and she had not pursued the matter further, a decision she tearfully described as the greatest regret of my life. The recovery and analysis of the murder weapon provided crucial details that strengthened the prosecution's case for premeditation. Forensic examination revealed that the .38 revolver had been meticulously cleaned and oiled shortly before the shooting, with trace amounts of gun oil still present on the barrel that matched a bottle found in Kane's bedroom drawer. The serial number had been partially filed down using a metal file also recovered from Kane's room, suggesting he had taken steps to make the weapon more difficult to trace. Most tellingly, investigators discovered that the standard ammunition had been replaced with hollow-point bullets, which expand upon impact to create more devastating wounds, a detail that suggested research and preparation beyond what might be expected from an impulsive act. Ammunition matching these hollow points was found hidden in a shoebox in Kane's closet, along with printed instructions on how to load and operate a revolver that had been accessed and printed from a public library computer 3 weeks before the shooting. Building a case against a 12-year-old defendant presented unique challenges beyond the typical homicide prosecution, particularly regarding the admissibility of certain types of evidence and statements. Prosecutor Martinez worked closely with the department's juvenile justice specialists to ensure that all evidence was collected and presented in accordance with the enhanced protections afforded to minors in the criminal justice system. This included having all interviews conducted in the presence of both legal counsel and a court-appointed guardian ad litem, using age-appropriate language when explaining legal concepts, conducting all interactions in specially designed juvenile interview rooms rather than standard police interrogation facilities, and limiting the duration of any questioning sessions to account for a child's shorter attention span and higher susceptibility to fatigue. These precautions were essential not only for protecting Kane's rights, but also for ensuring that any evidence obtained would withstand the heightened scrutiny that would inevitably accompany the prosecution of such a young defendant. A critical component of the prosecution's case was establishing that despite his age, Kane possessed the mental capacity to understand the nature and wrongfulness of his actions, a modern interpretation of the traditional infancy defense that presumes children under 14 lack the capacity to form criminal intent. To address this issue, the court ordered a comprehensive forensic psychological evaluation by a team of experts specializing in juvenile offenders. Dr. Samantha Reeves, the lead forensic psychologist, conducted 20 hours of interviews and assessments with Kane over a 6-week period, administering standardized tests measuring intellectual functioning, moral reasoning, impulse control, and psychological traits associated with antisocial behavior. Her findings, detailed in a 67-page report submitted to both prosecution and defense, indicated that Kane possessed above-average intelligence with a full-scale IQ of 122, showed advanced understanding of moral concepts including the permanence of death and the societal prohibition against killing, and demonstrated the capacity for complex planning and future orientation atypical for his chronological age. Most concerning in Dr. Reeves's evaluation was her assessment of Kane's psychological profile, which revealed what she termed pronounced callous unemotional traits and a concerning absence of empathic response. Using specialized assessment tools designed to measure psychopathic traits in juveniles, she documented Cain's inability to recognize or respond appropriately to others' emotions, his lack of remorse or guilt regarding his actions, his persistent lack of empathy, and his shallow performative emotional expressions that rarely extended beyond mild irritation or satisfaction at achieving his goals. These traits, while falling short of a formal diagnosis of psychopathy in someone so young, represented what Dr. Reeves described as a constellation of characteristics that severely impair normal social emotional development and significantly increase risk for violent behavior. Her report specifically noted that when shown photographs of Officer Wilson's family and asked how they might feel about his death, Cain had responded with clinical detachment, stating, "They probably feel sad, but people die every day. They'll find someone new." The prosecution also gathered evidence related to Cain's exposures to violent media, documenting his obsessive consumption of graphic videos depicting violence against police officers, his participation in online forums where such content was shared and celebrated, and his extensive play of violent video games, specifically featuring scenarios where players could attack law enforcement. While careful to avoid suggesting that media consumption alone could cause someone to commit violence, prosecutors built a narrative showing how these materials had provided both instruction and ideological reinforcement for Cain's existing antisocial tendencies. This approach allowed them to acknowledge the role of external influences without diminishing Cain's personal agency and responsibility, a balance that would become increasingly important as the defense prepared to argue that environmental factors and Cain's young age made him less culpable for his actions. As the investigation neared completion, prosecutors faced the momentous decision of whether to charge Cain Jones as an adult or proceed through the juvenile justice system. Pennsylvania law permitted discretion in this matter, even for defendants as young as 10 years old in first-degree murder cases. But such decisions typically involved careful weighing of multiple factors, including the severity of the offense, the defendant's previous history, the potential for rehabilitation, and the state's interest in punishing particularly heinous crimes. After extensive consultation with legal experts, child psychologists, and victim advocates, District Attorney Maria Gonzalez announced at a somber press conference that her office would proceed with adult charges against Cain Jones. The premeditated execution of a police officer represents the most serious offense in our criminal code, she stated, her voice firm but heavy with the weight of the decision. While we recognize and have carefully considered the defendant's young age, the calculated nature of this killing and the extensive evidence of planning demonstrate a level of criminal sophistication that demands the full accountability of adult prosecution. The moments following Cain Jones's apprehension in the playground 3 blocks from the shooting scene were captured in their entirety by police body cameras, providing a disturbing record of the 12-year-old's demeanor immediately after committing murder. Officer Regina Hayes, the first to spot Cain sitting alone on a swing with the murder weapon still in his hand, approached with her service weapon drawn but positioned at a downward angle, following department protocols for engaging with potentially dangerous juvenile suspects. "Police officer, put the gun down slowly and show me your hands," she called out, her voice firm but controlled, despite the knowledge that this small figure had just executed her colleague. The body camera footage showed Cain looking up without surprise or alarm, as though he had been expecting this moment, before carefully placing the revolver on the ground beside the swing and raising his hands with mechanical precision. There was no attempt to flee, no emotional outburst, not even the fearful response that would be expected from a child confronted by armed police officers, just a blank compliance that responding officers would later describe as profoundly unsettling. As Officers Hayes and her partner James Rodriguez secured the weapon and approached Cain to take him into custody, they maintained a professional dialogue that acknowledged both the severity of the situation and the suspect's young age. "You're under arrest for the shooting of a police officer," Hayes informed him, carefully applying size-appropriate restraints while continuing, "Because you're a juvenile, there are special procedures we need to follow, but I need you to understand that this is extremely serious." Kane's response, captured clearly on the body camera audio, provided the first glimpse into his mindset. "I know it's serious." That was the whole point. When Rodriguez asked him what he meant by that statement, Kane elaborated with chilling composure, "Nobody pays attention when kids do normal bad things. I wanted to do something that matters, that people will remember." This statement, made spontaneously before any Miranda warnings had been issued, would later be deemed admissible as evidence and would feature prominently in the prosecution's narrative of a child who, despite his age, had made a calculated decision to kill in pursuit of notoriety. Following his arrest, Kane was transported not to a standard police precinct, but to Philadelphia's specialized Juvenile Justice Services Center, where facilities and protocols are specifically designed for underage offenders. In accordance with Pennsylvania law regarding juvenile suspects, detectives contacted the on-call judge to secure authorization for questioning a minor in a homicide case, while simultaneously arranging for both a public defender specializing in juvenile cases and a court-appointed guardian ad litem to be present during any interrogation. The center's intake process revealed another layer of Kane's unusual affect as he approached the fingerprinting, photographing, and medical screening with what the intake officer described as the casual interest of someone watching a mildly engaging television show. When the medical examiner asked standard questions about whether he had any injuries or medical concerns, Kane replied, "I'm fine. It's the police officer who has the injuries," a statement delivered without any discernible emotion or recognition of its inappropriate nature. The formal interrogation began at 2:37 a.m., approximately 5 hours after the shooting, in a room specially designed for juvenile questioning with comfortable furniture, subdued lighting, and recording equipment that captured multiple angles to ensure transparency. Detective Michael Anderson led the questioning, accompanied by a child psychologist consultant, while Kane's court-appointed attorney Sarah Johnson and guardian ad litem Robert Williams sat beside him. Before beginning, Anderson carefully explained Kane's Miranda rights using age-appropriate language, checking frequently for comprehension, and ensuring that both the attorney and guardian verified Kane's understanding of his right to remain silent and have counsel present. Throughout this process, Kane maintained the same detached demeanor, nodding mechanically at appropriate moments but showing no signs of distress, confusion, or even the nervous energy typical of children in institutional settings. When the substantive questioning began, Kane's responses revealed a disturbing level of premeditation and clarity about his actions. "Can you tell me about what happened tonight on Kensington Avenue?" Anderson asked, keeping his tone neutral and conversational rather than confrontational. Kane straightened in his chair and began speaking with the ordered precision of someone delivering a prepared report. "I decided about 3 months ago that I was going to kill a police officer. I took my brother's gun from his closet last week and practiced loading and unloading it when nobody was home. Tonight I asked Marcus to take me with him to get food because I knew that area has a lot of police, and there was a good chance we'd get pulled over if I made sure Marcus did something wrong." He continued with the same flat affect, describing how he had intentionally distracted his brother at the intersection, causing him to run the red light that prompted Officer Wilson to initiate the traffic stop. The most chilling portion of the interrogation came when Anderson asked Kane why he had returned to Officer Wilson after initially shooting him and fired additional rounds into his already fallen body. Without hesitation or apparent awareness of the horror his answer would evoke, Kane explained, I read online that people sometimes survive being shot if the bullet doesn't hit the right spot. I wanted to make absolutely sure he was dead. That's why I aimed for his neck the second time. The articles I read said that's one of the most lethal places to shoot someone. When Anderson pressed him about his motivations, asking why he would want to kill a police officer he had never met, Cain's response revealed both his distorted thinking and his awareness of similar crimes. Police represent the system that keeps people down. Killing one of them makes a bigger statement than killing a regular person, and I knew it would make me famous, like those kids who shot up their schools, except what I did was harder and more impressive because police officers are trained and armed. Throughout the 3-hour interrogation, Cain displayed an unusual level of articulation for his age, using vocabulary and concepts that reflected both his above-average intelligence and his extensive research into violence and criminal behavior. He readily admitted to planning the killing for months, described in detail how he had studied police patrol patterns in the Kensington area to maximize his chances of encounter, and explained his decision to use his brother's car as a means of creating an opportunity for a traffic stop. When asked if he understood that Officer Wilson had a family, including children close to Cain's own age, he acknowledged this fact but showed no emotional response to it, stating simply, "That doesn't change anything. Everyone has a family. He chose to be a police officer knowing the risks." This combination of cognitive understanding without emotional comprehension reinforced the psychological evaluation's findings regarding Cain's pronounced callous, unemotional traits. At several points during the interrogation, Cain's attorney attempted to intervene, concerned that her client's forthright admissions were severely damaging his legal position. However, Cain repeatedly overrode her objection, stating, "I want to explain exactly what I did and why I did it. I'm not ashamed of it." This behavior placed his legal counsel in the unusual position of trying to protect a client who actively resisted such protection, a dynamic that would continue throughout the pretrial period and trial itself. When the guardian ad litem suggested taking a break to allow Cain time to rest, given the late hour and the fact that sleep deprivation can impair judgment, particularly in children, Cain dismissed this concern as well, insisting, "I'm not tired, and my thinking is perfectly clear. I want to keep talking." These exchanges reinforced the impression of Cain as someone determined to claim ownership and even pride in his actions, displaying a level of agency and intentionality rarely seen in juvenile offenders. A significant portion of the interrogation focused on Cain's home life and potential mitigating factors that might help explain, if not excuse, his actions. Detective Anderson explored Cain's relationship with his incarcerated father, his mother's struggles with addiction, and his living situation with his grandmother. When asked if he felt these difficult circumstances had influenced his decision to commit violence, Cain rejected the suggestion outright. That's what adults always want to think, that kids do bad things because something bad happened to them. But that's not why I did this. I did it because I wanted to, because I had been thinking about it for a long time, and because I knew it would change how people see me. Nobody would ever call me just a kid again after this. This statement, perhaps more than any other made during the interrogation, captured the tragic paradox at the heart of the case. A child whose desperate bid to be taken seriously as something other than a child had led him to commit an act of such adult violence that the justice system would indeed be forced to treat him as something other than a child. In the closing stages of the interrogation, Anderson attempted to probe for any sign of remorse or emotional reaction to the reality of having taken a human life. Officer Wilson will never go home to his family again. His children will grow up without their father because of what you did tonight. How does that make you feel? He asked, watching Cain closely for any crack in his effective armor. After a moment's consideration, Cain replied, "I understand that those are sad consequences, but they don't make me feel anything special. It's like reading about someone dying in another country. You know it's supposed to be sad, but you don't actually feel sad because it doesn't connect to you. When pressed further about whether he would make the same choice again, knowing the outcome, Kane's response was immediate and unambiguous. Yes, I would do exactly the same thing. I accomplished what I set out to do. This exchange, more than any physical evidence or witness testimony, would later form the foundation for the prosecution's argument that Kane Jones, despite his chronological age, possessed a clear understanding of his actions and their consequences, yet chose to proceed with premeditated murder. As the interrogation concluded, Kane was informed that he would be held at the Juvenile Justice Services Center pending arraignment and determination of whether he would be charged as an adult or a juvenile. Rather than showing concern about this information, he asked a question that disturbed even the experienced officers and legal professionals in the room. When will the news start reporting about me? Will they show my picture? This focus on publicity and recognition, coming from a 12-year-old who had just admitted to executing a police officer, crystallized the understanding that Kane's actions had been driven not by impulse, peer pressure, or lack of comprehension, but by a calculated desire for notoriety. Detective Anderson, maintaining his professional demeanor despite his internal reaction, simply informed Kane that media coverage would be handled according to regulations regarding juvenile offenders, and that his immediate focus should be on cooperating with his attorney to prepare for the legal proceedings ahead. The following morning, as news of Officer Wilson's murder dominated local headlines and began attracting national attention, the juvenile detention staff documented another troubling aspect of Kane's behavior. Rather than showing anxiety or distress about his situation, he repeatedly asked for access to newspapers or television news, explicitly stating that he wanted to see the coverage of his crime. When this request was denied as part of standard protocols for juvenile offenders, particularly those whose cases involve media interest, Kane became visibly irritated, the first strong emotion he had displayed since his arrest. "But the whole point was for people to know what I did," he complained to the detention officer. "What good is it if I can't see how people are reacting?" This fixation on public recognition, combined with his previous statements during interrogation, painted a picture of a juvenile offender motivated not by the impulsivity or peer influence often seen in young offenders, but by a calculated pursuit of notoriety through violence, a motive more commonly associated with adult mass shooters and terrorists than with preteen offenders. The Philadelphia County Courthouse stood as an imposing monument to justice, its granite facade and grand columns projecting an aura of permanence and authority that seemed at odds with the unprecedented nature of the case about to unfold within its walls. On the morning of September 15th, 6 months after Officer James Wilson's murder, the building was surrounded by a phalanx of police officers standing shoulder to shoulder, creating a protective barrier between the courthouse and the hundreds of protesters who had gathered on the sidewalks with competing messages. On one side stood supporters of the Wilson family holding Blue Lives Matter signs and calling for maximum punishment, while across the street, juvenile justice advocates carried banners reading, "He's still a child," and "Rehabilitation, not retribution." The atmosphere was charged with emotion and the potential for conflict, reflecting the broader societal debate that had been raging since the announcement that 12-year-old Kane Jones would be tried as an adult for first-degree murder of a police officer. Inside courtroom 453, Judge Eleanor Simmons, a 30-year veteran of the bench with extensive experience in both adult criminal cases and juvenile matters, prepared to oversee what many legal experts were calling the most challenging trial of her distinguished career. The decision to assign Judge Simmons to the case had been deliberate, as her reputation for strict adherence to procedural rules and unflappable courtroom management made her ideally suited to navigate the unique challenges of trying a defendant whose feet would barely touch the floor when seated at the defense table. The courtroom itself had been specially modified for the proceedings, with the witness stand positioned to ensure that jurors could clearly see Cain's face without having to look down at him, a subtle but important accommodation to prevent his physical stature from unconsciously influencing perceptions of his agency or culpability. The jury box had been screened from public and media view with privacy panels protecting the identities of jurors in a case that had already generated numerous threats against anyone perceived as sympathetic to the young defendant. The jury selection process had been extraordinarily complex, requiring 4 weeks of careful questioning to assemble a panel capable of setting aside both the natural protective instincts adults typically feel toward children and the equally powerful emotions evoked by the murder of a police officer. The final jury comprised 7 women and 5 men from diverse backgrounds, including a pediatric nurse, a retired high school principal, an electrician, a social worker, a bank manager, a grocery store clerk, a college professor specializing in developmental psychology, a construction foreman, a librarian, a pharmacy technician, a software engineer, and a bus driver. 4 alternates had also been selected, a higher number than usual given the anticipated length of the trial and the heightened risk that jurors might be exposed to outside influences in such a high-profile case. Each juror had affirmed under oath their ability to apply the law as instructed, regardless of the defendant's age, though several had openly acknowledged the emotional difficulty of doing so. At precisely 9 o'clock, the side door to the courtroom opened and Cain Jones entered, escorted by 2 juvenile detention officers who, despite the serious nature of the charges, maintained a protective rather than punitive stance toward their young charge. The courtroom fell silent as those present got their first glimpse of the defendant who had been at the center of intense public discourse for months. Dressed in a navy blue suit that appeared to have been carefully tailored to fit his small frame, with his light brown hair neatly combed and his hands free of restraints in accordance with juvenile defendant protocols. Cain looked remarkably ordinary, a child who might otherwise be entering a middle school classroom rather than a murder trial. This visual disconnect between his appearance and the gravity of his alleged crime created an almost palpable tension in the courtroom, a cognitive dissonance that would persist throughout the proceedings. As Cain took his seat between his defense attorneys, the contrast between him and his legal team was striking. Lead defense counsel Rebecca Morrison, a formidable presence in Philadelphia's legal community, known for her work in complex juvenile cases, towered over her client both physically and in terms of her commanding courtroom presence. Beside her sat James Chen, a specialist in forensic psychology and juvenile brain development, who had been brought onto the defense team specifically to navigate the complex scientific evidence regarding adolescent cognitive and emotional development that would form a cornerstone of their case. The defense table was stacked with binders of scientific research, psychological evaluations, and case law regarding juvenile culpability, the ammunition for what promised to be a legally sophisticated defense focused not on denying Cain's actions, but on challenging the adult standard of accountability being applied to them. Across the aisle, the prosecution team was led by Elizabeth Martinez, her usual confident demeanor tempered by the gravity of prosecuting a defendant so young for a crime so serious. Supporting her were Assistant District Attorney Michael Brooks, a specialist in homicide prosecution, and Sarah Johnson, brought in specifically for her expertise in cases involving juvenile offenders being tried in adult court. Their table was comparatively sparse, reflecting their strategy to focus on the straightforward facts of the case rather than complex legal theories. Cain Jones had planned and executed the murder of Officer James Wilson, and the evidence proving this was overwhelming. Their case would emphasize Cain's meticulous planning, clear understanding of his actions, and complete lack of remorse arguing that these factors justified adult prosecution despite his age. The gallery behind the prosecution was filled with police officers in dress uniforms, their badges wrapped with black mourning bands in honor of their fallen colleague. Officer Wilson's widow, Angela, sat in the front row, flanked by her 3 children and her parents, their faces solemn and eyes focused steadfastly forward, deliberately avoiding looking at the small figure at the defense table. Behind the defense sat Cain's grandmother, Elaine, her face lined with grief and confusion, and notably absent were his mother, still in rehabilitation, and his father, watching the proceedings from a prison where he was serving his sentence for armed robbery. Marcus Jones, Cain's older brother, was not present either, as he was being held in a separate facility awaiting trial on charges related to the illegal firearm used in the murder. Judge Simmons called the court to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel, her voice clear and authoritative as she addressed the packed courtroom. "These proceedings will be conducted with the utmost decorum and respect for the legal process," she stated, her gaze sweeping across the gallery. "The fact that the defendant is a juvenile being tried as an adult presents unique circumstances, but the fundamental principles of justice remain unchanged. The prosecution must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense has the right to challenge evidence and present alternatives, and this court will ensure that all legal standards and protections are rigorously maintained." With these words, she established the tone for what would follow, a trial that would acknowledge the defendant's youth while refusing to allow that factor to undermine the serious pursuit of justice for a fallen officer. The opening statements began with Prosecutor Martinez rising slowly, her movements deliberately measured as she approached the jury box. Officer James Wilson left for work on an ordinary Tuesday evening, kissing his wife goodbye and promising his children he would be home in time to read them a bedtime story, she began, her voice steady but filled with understated emotion. He never returned home because the defendant, Cain Jones, had decided that Officer Wilson, or any police officer he encountered, deserved to die, not for any personal grievance, but simply for the uniform he wore and the badge he carried. Martinez then methodically outlined the evidence the jury would see, including the body camera footage showing Cain firing at Officer Wilson, the detailed plans found in his bedroom, and his own recorded statements admitting to planning the killing for months. The evidence will show that Cain Jones, despite being 12 years old, acted with a level of premeditation, calculation, and moral disengagement that demonstrates full awareness of the nature and consequences of his actions, she concluded. Age is a fact, not an excuse, and in this case, the facts will show that Cain Jones made an adult decision to take a human life, and justice demands that he face adult consequences. Defense attorney Morrison's approach offered a stark contrast, beginning not with emotional appeals, but with scientific precision. "The human brain," she told the jury, making deliberate eye contact with each member, "undergoes critical development well into a person's 20s. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for impulse control, rational decision-making, and understanding long-term consequences, is particularly underdeveloped in early adolescence." She projected a simplified diagram of the brain onto a screen visible to the jury using a laser pointer to indicate the relevant regions. This is not a matter of opinion or legal theory, but established neuroscientific fact, recognized by the Supreme Court in multiple decisions regarding juvenile offenders. Morrison acknowledged that Cain had shot Officer Wilson, making clear that their defense would not contest this basic fact, but would instead focus on his capacity to be held to adult standards of culpability. A 12-year-old who commits a terrible act is still a 12-year-old, with a 12-year-old's brain, a 12-year-old's emotional development, and a 12-year-old's limited ability to fully comprehend the permanence and moral weight of taking a human life, she argued. The law has long recognized that children are different, not just smaller versions of adults, and justice requires that we respond to juvenile crime with this fundamental difference in mind. As the opening statements concluded, Kane Jones's behavior became the subject of intense scrutiny from everyone in the courtroom, from the jury to the media representatives, taking detailed notes from the designated press section. Throughout both presentations, he had remained remarkably still, his expression neutral, as he listened to descriptions of his actions and arguments about his capacity for adult decision-making. When Martinez had described the shooting in graphic detail, he showed no visible distress or remorse. And when his own attorney had essentially described his brain as immature and undeveloped, he displayed neither embarrassment nor agreement. This affective flatness, which had been noted by every professional who had interacted with him since his arrest, seemed to simultaneously support both the prosecution's portrayal of him as callously indifferent to his crime and the defense's argument that his emotional processing was fundamentally different from an adult's. The jury members, initially stealing only occasional glances at the young defendant, increasingly found their attention drawn to his unusually composed demeanor, searching his face for clues to the mystery at the center of the case. How a child so young could commit an act of such calculated violence. The prosecution's case began with testimony from first responders who had arrived at the scene of Officer Wilson's shooting, their accounts establishing the timeline and immediate circumstances of the crime. Paramedic Jennifer Collins described finding Officer Wilson already in cardiac arrest upon her arrival, his carotid artery severed by the shot to his neck, creating a wound incompatible with survival despite our most aggressive resuscitative efforts. Officer Regina Hayes recounted finding Kane in the playground shortly after the shooting, describing his calm demeanor and how the murder weapon had still been in his hand. With each witness, Martinez built a methodical narrative of the events of that evening, establishing not just what had happened, but also Kane's behavior and statements in the immediate aftermath, emphasizing his lack of panic, remorse, or even excitement, all emotions that might be expected from a child who had just committed a traumatic act of violence. The most powerful moment of the prosecution's opening day came with the presentation of Officer Wilson's body camera footage, shown on monitors positioned throughout the courtroom. Judge Simmons had issued a specific warning before the video played, acknowledging its graphic nature and instructing everyone present to maintain their composure regardless of their emotional reaction. The footage began with Officer Wilson's routine approach to the vehicle, his voice professional as he explained the reason for the stop to Marcus Jones. The camera captured the moment Wilson leaned slightly toward the driver's window, and then the sudden movement from the back seat as Kane lunged forward, arm extended. The flash of the muzzle momentarily whited out the screen, followed by the jerking motion of the camera as Wilson fell backward. Audible gasps escaped from several jurors and spectators as the video continued from the perspective of Wilson's body camera, now facing upward from the ground, capturing Kane's small figure approaching, and the two additional muzzle flashes that followed before the boy calmly walked away from the frame. As this damning evidence was presented, all eyes inevitably returned to Kane Jones, searching for any reaction to seeing his own actions played back in such stark detail. Throughout the video, he remained still, his expression unchanged, occasionally glancing toward his attorney, but showing none of the distress, shame, or even excitement that might be expected from a child confronted with evidence of their violence. This apparent emotional detachment would become a double-edged sword in the proceedings, either evidence of his disturbing lack of remorse, as the prosecution argued, or demonstration of his fundamental psychological differences from adults, as the defense maintained. As the first day of trial concluded, the question hanging in the air was not whether Kane Jones had killed Officer James Wilson, a fact no one disputed, but whether a justice system designed for adults could or should accommodate the profound developmental differences of a 12-year-old who had committed an adult crime with seemingly adult calculation. The 8th day of the trial brought the most anticipated testimony yet, as forensic psychologist Dr. Samantha Reeves took the stand to present her comprehensive evaluation of Kane Jones's psychological state and capacity for adult-level culpability. Dr. Reeves, with her credentials, including 22 years of specialized work with juvenile offenders and over 100 publications in peer-reviewed journals, represented the prosecution's strongest response to the defense's neurodevelopmental arguments. The courtroom was filled to capacity, with legal observers and professionals from across the country present to witness what many considered groundbreaking testimony in the evolving field of juvenile justice. Dr. Reeves approached the witness stand with deliberate confidence, her gray suit and minimal jewelry projecting professional authority as she took the oath and settled into the chair, adjusting the microphone to accommodate her quiet, precise speaking style that nonetheless commanded complete attention. Prosecutor Martinez began by establishing Dr. Reeves's extensive qualifications and the comprehensive nature of her evaluation, which had included 20 hours of clinical interviews with Kane, standardized psychological testing, reviews of his academic and medical records, interviews with family members and teachers, and careful analysis of his writings, drawings, and online activities. Could you explain to the jury your primary findings regarding the defendant's psychological functioning? Martinez asked, opening the door to what would become the most damning expert testimony of the trial. Dr. Reeves turned slightly to address the jury directly, her voice steady as she delivered her professional assessment. My evaluation revealed that Kane Jones presents with significant callous, unemotional traits, marked by a pronounced lack of empathy, absence of remorse, shallow emotional experience, and comfort with manipulation and deception. These traits exist alongside above-average intelligence and the capacity for detailed planning toward goal-directed behavior, creating a concerning combination of emotional detachment and cognitive sophistication that is rare in a 12-year-old. Dr. Reeves then methodically walked the jury through the specific evidence supporting her conclusions, displaying slides that showed Kane's responses to various psychological assessment tools. On measures designed to assess empathic capacity, Kane scored in the lowest percentile, demonstrating an inability to recognize or respond appropriately to others' emotional states, she explained, showing a graph that compared his scores to normative data for his age group. When shown images of people in distress and asked to describe what they might be feeling, he could intellectually label the emotions but showed no physiological signs of empathic resonance. His heart rate, skin conductance, and other autonomic measures remained flat, indicating no emotional mirroring or internal response to others' suffering. This clinical observation was further supported by examples from her interviews, where Kane had demonstrated what Dr. Reeves termed cognitive empathy without emotional empathy, the ability to identify others' feelings in an abstract, intellectual way without experiencing any corresponding emotional reaction. The testimony grew more disturbing as Dr. Reeves detailed Kane's responses to questions specifically about Officer Wilson's murder. When asked directly about how he felt about taking a human life, Kane responded with unusual candor, stating, "I don't feel anything special about it. I know I'm supposed to feel bad, but I don't. It was just something I decided to do, and I did it." She described how she had then pressed him about understanding the permanence of death and the impact on Officer Wilson's family, to which Kane had replied, "Of course I understand he's never coming back. That was the whole point of shooting him in the neck, to make sure he died. And yes, his family probably misses him, but that's not really my problem." These responses, delivered in what Dr. Reeves described as a conversational tone one might use to discuss a homework assignment, revealed not a lack of cognitive understanding, but a profound absence of emotional connection to the moral weight of his actions. The most technically significant portion of Dr. Reeves's testimony addressed the question at the heart of the case. Despite his chronological age, did Kane Jones possess the capacity to form adult-level intent and understand the wrongfulness of his actions? Her conclusion challenged the defense's blanket assertions about juvenile brain development. While it is absolutely true that adolescent brains differ from adult brains in important ways, particularly in areas related to impulse control and risk assessment, Kane's case presents important distinctions from the typical juvenile offender. His actions were not impulsive, but planned over months, not driven by peer influence or momentary emotion, but by calculated intention, and not carried out without consideration of consequences, but with clear anticipation of both the immediate outcome, Officer Wilson's death, and the broader consequences, his own notoriety and punishment. This nuanced assessment acknowledged the general scientific consensus about adolescent brain development, while arguing that Kane represented an outlier whose specific psychological profile and behaviors demonstrated capacities not typical for his age group. During cross-examination, defense attorney Morrison sought to challenge Dr. Reeves's conclusions, focusing particularly on the ethical questions surrounding applying adult standards to a preteen brain regardless of his specific psychological profile. Dr. Reeves, would you agree that regardless of his particular traits, Kane's brain is still physically and neurologically that of a 12-year-old, with all the developmental limitations that entails? She asked, attempting to return the focus to the structural rather than functional aspects of brain development. Dr. Reeves acknowledged the physical reality of Kane's developing brain, but refused to concede the larger point. Yes, his brain is structurally that of a 12-year-old, but that fact alone doesn't determine capacity or culpability. What we observe in Kane's case is functioning that diverges significantly from typical developmental patterns, particularly in his capacity for sustained, goal-directed planning and his awareness of the moral significance of his actions, even if he doesn't experience the emotional responses we would expect to accompany that awareness. This distinction between understanding and feeling would become a central point of contention as the expert testimony continued, with the prosecution arguing that Kane's cognitive understanding was sufficient for culpability, while the defense maintained that emotional development was equally essential to the concept of adult responsibility. Following Dr. Reeves's testimony, the prosecution presented what many observers considered their most compelling evidence: Kane's own words, captured in the journal entries recovered from his bedroom. Detective Michael Anderson returned to the stand to authenticate these materials and provide context for their recovery during the initial investigation. The journal, titled My Mission, in careful block letters on its cover, was displayed on the courtroom monitors, its pages turned slowly to reveal increasingly detailed plans for killing a police officer. Entries dating back 3 months before the shooting showed the evolution of Kane's planning from initial ideation: "I've decided that killing a cop would make the biggest impact. Everyone pays attention when a cop dies," to specific tactical considerations: best places to shoot, head, neck, center chest. Need to make sure to hit something vital. To logistical arrangements: going to take Marcus's gun next time he leaves it in his closet. He never checks it so he won't notice. The final entry, dated just 2 days before Officer Wilson's murder, was particularly chilling in its clarity of purpose. "Tomorrow Marcus is driving to get food in Kensington. Perfect opportunity. We'll bring the gun. If we get pulled over, I'll finally complete my mission. After tomorrow, everyone will know my name." These journal entries demolished any suggestion that Kane's actions had been impulsive or undertaken without full awareness of their gravity. Prosecutor Martinez had Detective Anderson read selected passages aloud, the child's words echoing through the courtroom in the detective's deep, somber voice. a jarring contrast that emphasized the disconnect between Kane's physical youth and the mature calculation evident in his writings. The journal also contained numerous references to Kane's desire for fame and recognition, with repeated statements like, "I'll be on every news channel, and people will study me and try to figure me out," suggesting that his primary motivation had been notoriety rather than any ideological opposition to law enforcement. This evidence of fame-seeking as a motive resonated with Dr. Reeves's testimony about Kane's callous, unemotional traits, painting a picture of a child whose emotional emptiness had created a hunger for significance through infamous acts. The prosecution's case reached its emotional peak with the testimony of Angela Wilson, Officer James Wilson's widow, who took the stand on the 10th day of trial to provide victim impact testimony. Dressed in a simple black dress with her husband's police badge pinned over her heart, Mrs. Wilson maintained remarkable composure as she described the devastating impact of her husband's murder on their family. "My children don't just miss their father, they've lost their sense of safety in the world," she testified, her voice steady despite the tears that occasionally slipped down her cheeks. "My 10-year-old son, who is 2 years younger than the defendant, has nightmares where he sees his dad being shot. He asked me recently if bad people could come to our house and hurt us too." She described the emptiness of family traditions without James present, the financial struggles following the loss of his income, and the emotional toll of trying to support 3 grieving children while managing her own profound loss. What made Angela Wilson's testimony particularly powerful was her refusal to demonize Kane despite her overwhelming grief. "I don't know why a 12-year-old child would plan and carry out the murder of a man he never met," she told the hushed courtroom. "I don't understand it, and that lack of understanding makes our loss even more difficult to bear. James spent his career trying to help children like Kane before they went down destructive paths, and there's a terrible irony that he was killed by a child who might once have benefited from his mentoring programs." When Martinez asked her what justice would mean in this case, Angela's response captured the complexity of the situation better than any legal argument. "Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about acknowledging the full truth of what happened, that my husband was murdered in cold blood while doing his job, that his killer knew exactly what he was doing, and that our family's loss is permanent and irreparable. But justice also requires recognizing that the person who took James from us is still, in many ways, a child. And that fact matters even if it doesn't excuse what he did." The defense case began with testimony from Dr. Alan Brodsky, a leading neuroscientist specializing in adolescent brain development, whose research had been cited in multiple Supreme Court decisions regarding juvenile offenders. Using colorful brain scans and simplified diagrams, Dr. Brodsky explained the fundamental differences between adolescent and adult brains, emphasizing that the prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control, rational decision-making, and appreciation of long-term consequences, remains significantly underdeveloped until the mid-20s. "This is not a matter of opinion, but of biological fact," he testified, displaying side-by-side MRI images of 12-year-old and adult brains. The structural and functional differences are clearly visible in these scans. The connections between the emotional centers of the brain and the rational control centers are simply not fully formed in a 12-year-old, regardless of how intelligent or mature they might appear in other ways. This testimony directly challenged Dr. Reeves's assessments, suggesting that, regardless of Kane's specific psychological traits, the hardware of his brain fundamentally limited his capacity for adult-level moral reasoning and impulse control. Dr. Brodsky went further, introducing research showing that children with early life trauma and disrupted attachment, factors present in Kane's history with his father's incarceration, and mother's addiction issues, often develop abnormal emotional responses as a protective mechanism. What might appear as callousness or lack of empathy in a child who has experienced significant instability can actually represent a defensive adaptation, the brain protecting itself from overwhelming emotional input by dampening emotional responses across the board, he explained. This alternative interpretation of Cain's flat effect and apparent lack of remorse suggested that these traits might represent psychological injury rather than inherent character, potentially supporting an argument for rehabilitation rather than purely punitive approaches. When Morrison asked whether a child with these developmental and psychological characteristics could truly form adult-level intent, Dr. Brodsky's response was unambiguous. No, they might understand their actions on an intellectual level and even plan them carefully, but they cannot fully comprehend or integrate the moral and emotional dimensions of those actions in the way an adult can. The most controversial testimony came from Dr. Eleanor Franklin, a forensic psychiatrist who had conducted an independent evaluation of Cain at the defense's request and reached conclusions that sharply contradicted Dr. Reeves's assessments. Where Reeves had emphasized Cain's callous, unemotional traits and capacity for adult-like planning, Dr. Franklin characterized him as a severely traumatized child whose emotional development had been profoundly distorted by early life instability, exposure to violence, and lack of consistent nurturing relationships. What we see in Cain is not the calculated behavior of a miniature adult, but the desperate action of a child who has learned that extreme behavior is the only way to have impact in a world where he has otherwise felt powerless and invisible, she testified. His obsession with fame and recognition through violence represents a profound developmental distortion, not evidence of adult-like criminal sophistication. This interpretation cast Cain's journal entries and methodical planning not as evidence of adult-level culpability, but as symptoms of severe psychological disturbance rooted in childhood trauma. The expert testimony battle between prosecution and defense created a complex portrait of a child who existed at the intersection of developmental immaturity, psychological disturbance, and genuine capacity for calculated harm. As each side presented their evidence and interpretation, the fundamental question before the jury evolved from the relatively straightforward matter of whether Cain had killed Officer Wilson, a fact no one disputed, to the vastly more complex question of how to understand and respond to violence committed by a person who was simultaneously a child in chronological age and brain development, yet capable of actions that defied conventional understanding of childhood. The testimony had created a difficult moral and legal calculus. How should society respond when a 12-year-old commits an act with adult-like calculation, but with a brain that science confirms is fundamentally different from an adult's? Throughout these expert testimonies, Cain Jones's demeanor in court remained consistent, attentive but emotionally detached, occasionally taking notes on a legal pad, or leaning to whisper a comment to his attorney but showing no visible distress, shame, or other emotional reaction to the detailed discussions of his actions and psychology. This very flatness of affect became evidence for both sides, with the prosecution pointing to it as confirmation of his disturbing lack of remorse and the defense citing it as demonstration of his abnormal emotional development and processing. The jury found themselves in the uncomfortable position of trying to read meaning into the blank canvas of a child's face as they absorbed the competing expert narratives about the mind behind that impassive expression. On the 17th day of trial, as closing arguments concluded and Judge Simmons delivered her final instructions to the jury, a tense silence fell over the courtroom that seemed to compress the air itself. You must determine whether the Commonwealth has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Cain Jones committed first-degree murder, which requires finding that he killed Officer Wilson with specific intent to kill and with premeditation and deliberation," the judge explained, her voice clear and measured. "In considering this question, you have heard expert testimony regarding the defendant's age and brain development. The law recognizes that juvenile offenders may have diminished culpability compared to adults, but it does not categorically exempt them from adult prosecution for serious offenses." She further instructed the jury that if they found Cain guilty of first-degree murder, a separate sentencing phase would follow where they would make recommendations regarding punishment, taking into account both the severity of the crime and the defendant's youth as a significant mitigating factor. As the jury filed out to begin deliberations, courthouse officials implemented the extensive security protocols that had been planned in anticipation of this moment. Philadelphia police established expanded perimeters around the building, separating the growing crowds of protesters who had gathered outside, law enforcement supporters on one side, calling for maximum punishment, juvenile justice advocates on the other, arguing that no child should face adult prison regardless of their crime. News helicopters circled overhead, capturing aerial images of the quay, scene that would be broadcast nationally, while reporters from major networks positioned themselves strategically for live updates once the verdict was announced. Inside the courthouse, Cain was taken to a secure holding area equipped with age-appropriate accommodations, while his defense team gathered in a conference room to prepare for all possible outcomes, and the prosecution briefed Officer Wilson's family on what to expect in the hours ahead. The jury's deliberations extended far longer than most legal observers had anticipated, stretching across 4 full days as they grappled with the complex intersection of legal standards, developmental science, and the undisputed facts of the case. Notes sent to the judge requested clarification on specific points of law regarding juvenile culpability and asked for portions of both Dr. Reeves's and Dr. Brodsky's testimony to be read back to them, suggesting that the scientific evidence about adolescent brain development was central to their discussions. The length of deliberations created a growing sense of tension throughout Philadelphia, with police departments implementing 12-hour shifts to ensure adequate staffing for any potential public response to the verdict, while schools in the downtown area developed contingency plans for early dismissal if unrest occurred. Local news provided almost continuous coverage, featuring panels of legal experts and child psychologists debating the case's implications for juvenile justice nationwide. On the afternoon of the 4th day of deliberations, at precisely 3:17 p.m., the court clerk received notification that the jury had reached a verdict. As word spread through the courthouse and out to the crowds beyond, Angela Wilson gathered her children in a private room, surrounded by supportive family members and victim advocates who had been with them throughout the ordeal. Cain's grandmother, Elaine Jones, sat alone in another waiting area, having been the only family member consistently present during the trial, her face lined with the strain of witnessing both the evidence of her grandson's calculated violence and the public vilification that had extended to her as the adult most directly responsible for his upbringing. Judge Simmons ordered enhanced security measures for the courtroom, limiting attendance to immediate family members, essential legal personnel, and a small pool of reporters, while arranging for live audio feed to an overflow room where additional media and legal observers could hear the proceedings. At 4 o'clock, the courtroom doors were locked, and Judge Simmons called the court to order as Cain was escorted to the defense table by juvenile officers. His small stature remained jarring in the formal setting of the adult courtroom. His suit, the same navy blue one he had worn throughout the trial, hanging slightly looser on his frame after weight loss during the weeks of proceedings. The jury entered silently, their faces solemn, and many showing signs of emotional exhaustion from their extended deliberations. The foreman, a middle-aged African-American woman who worked as a pediatric nurse, handed the verdict form to the court officer, who delivered it to Judge Simmons. The judge reviewed the document, her expression revealing nothing, as she returned it to the clerk for reading. In that moment of suspension between decision and declaration, the only sound in the courtroom was the soft crying of Officer Wilson's teenage daughter and the rhythmic tapping of Cain's foot against the leg of his chair, a rare display of nervous energy from the otherwise composed defendant. In the matter of Commonwealth versus Cain Jones, on the charge of murder in the first degree, we, the jury, find the defendant. The clerk paused, the weight of the moment seeming to physically slow his words. Guilty. A collective exhalation swept through the courtroom, followed immediately by a sob from Elaine Jones and the sound of Officer Wilson's widow whispering, "Thank God," as she clutched her children's hands. Judge Simmons immediately called for order, her gavel striking with authority, as several officers in the gallery had begun to applaud before catching themselves. "This court will maintain absolute decorum," she stated firmly before addressing the jury. "The court thanks you for your service in this difficult case. You are now dismissed from the guilt phase, but I must remind you that your service is not complete, as you will be recalled for the sentencing phase of these proceedings, which will begin 1 week from today." Outside the courthouse, as news of the guilty verdict spread, the reactions reflected the deep divisions the case had exposed in public opinion. On one side of the police barricade, officers and their supporters embraced, many in tears as they expressed relief that their fallen colleague's killer had been held accountable regardless of his age. "This sends a message that you can't hide behind your youth when you deliberately take the life of someone protecting our community," said Police Union President Michael Barnes to assembled reporters. Across the barrier, juvenile justice advocates responded with expressions of grief and anger, many holding signs reading, "Children don't belong in adult prisons," and chanting, "Rehabilitation, not retribution." Sarah Johnson, director of the Children's Rights Coalition, told journalists, "Today we've decided that a troubled 12-year-old child is beyond redemption, and that decision says more about our collective failure to protect and rehabilitate vulnerable children than it does about Cain Jones's actions." The sentencing phase began 1 week later, with the same jury now tasked with making a recommendation regarding Cain's punishment. Under Pennsylvania law, a conviction for first-degree murder typically carried a mandatory sentence of life without parole, but Supreme Court rulings in Miller v. Alabama and Montgomery v. Louisiana had established that juvenile offenders could not receive mandatory life sentences without consideration of their youth and potential for rehabilitation. The prosecution and defense presented additional evidence specifically relevant to sentencing, with the prosecution emphasizing the premeditated nature of the crime and Cain's continued lack of remorse, while the defense highlighted research on adolescent brain development and the potential for meaningful rehabilitation, particularly in a juvenile who had committed his crime before reaching his teens. This phase of the proceedings was, in many ways, even more emotionally charged than the trial itself, as it forced direct confrontation with the question of what justice looks like when the perpetrator of a capital crime is a child. After deliberating for 2 days on the sentencing recommendation, the jury returned with a decision that reflected both the severity of the crime and recognition of Cain's extreme youth. They recommended a sentence of 25 years to life, with the possibility of parole consideration after 25 years when Cain would be 37 years old. This recommendation, while substantial, fell far short of the de facto life sentence that many law enforcement supporters had advocated for. It represented an attempt to balance punitive justice with the possibility of eventual rehabilitation and release if Cain demonstrated significant change during his incarceration. Judge Simmons received this recommendation and scheduled a formal sentencing hearing for 2 weeks later, during which she would make the final determination after considering victim impact statements, defense presentations on mitigation, and her own assessment of the appropriate balance between justice and recognition of the defendant's developmental status. The sentencing hearing began with impact statements from Officer Wilson's family, including a statement written by his 16-year-old son, Michael, that was read aloud by the prosecutor. "My dad missed my high school graduation. He'll miss my college graduation, my wedding, and meeting his grandchildren. The person who took him away from us might someday walk free, but our sentence of living without my dad will never end." Angela Wilson spoke directly to Cain, her voice trembling but resolute. "I don't hate you, Cain. I can't understand what you did or why you did it, but I don't hate you. What I want is for you to truly understand someday what you've taken from my children and from me, and for that understanding to transform you into someone who would never again harm another human being. That would be the justice my husband would have wanted." These statements moved many in the courtroom to tears, including several jurors who had returned to observe the sentencing, though Cain himself remained expressionless, his gaze focused on a spot on the wall above the witness stand. Defense attorney Morrison presented extensive mitigation evidence, including detailed treatment plans developed by specialists in juvenile rehabilitation and testimony from directors of juvenile correctional facilities that offered intensive therapeutic programming. Cain Jones committed a terrible act, but he remains a child with a developing brain and the capacity for profound change, Morrison argued. The sentence this court imposes should reflect not just retribution for what he did at 12, but the possibility of who he might become through appropriate intervention, education, and therapy. She presented research showing that juvenile offenders, even those who committed serious violent crimes, had significantly lower recidivism rates than adult offenders when provided with appropriate rehabilitation services, and argued that Cain's age made him particularly amenable to such interventions. When it came time for Judge Simmons to deliver her sentence, the courtroom fell silent, all eyes fixed on the bench as she prepared to determine the future of a child who had committed an adult crime with devastating consequences. "Cain Jones," she began, addressing him directly, "you have been found guilty of the first-degree murder of Officer James Wilson, a crime you planned with calculation and carried out with precision unusual for someone of your age. The law places upon me the heavy responsibility of determining an appropriate sentence, one that acknowledges the gravity of taking a human life, recognizes your youth as a significant mitigating factor, protects society from potential future harm, and leaves open the possibility of rehabilitation." She paused, looking down at her notes before continuing with evident gravity. After careful consideration of the jury's recommendation, the victim impact statements, the defense's mitigation evidence, and relevant case law regarding juvenile sentencing, I hereby sentence you to 110 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole consideration after serving 30 years. The sentence, far exceeding the jury's recommendation, sent immediate shockwaves through the courtroom, with gasps from the gallery and Morrison rising quickly to her feet to object. "Your Honor, this sentence amounts to a de facto life sentence for a 12-year-old defendant, which directly contradicts Supreme Court rulings on juvenile sentencing," she argued urgently. Judge Simmons raised her hand to silence the objection, continuing her explanation. "I have structured this sentence specifically to comply with legal precedent while acknowledging the exceptional nature of this case. The defendant will become eligible for parole consideration at age 42, providing a meaningful opportunity for release if rehabilitation occurs, while the overall length of the sentence reflects the premeditated nature of Officer Wilson's murder and the court's assessment of the defendant's unique psychological profile as described in expert testimony." She added that Cain would be placed initially in a juvenile facility until age 18, at which point a hearing would determine the appropriate adult facility for the remainder of his sentence and ordered comprehensive psychological treatment, educational programming, and regular review of his progress. The 110-year sentence with the possibility of parole after 30 years represented one of the longest sentences ever imposed on a defendant who committed their crime as a preteen. Outside the courthouse, protesters on both sides reacted with intense emotion, law enforcement supporters generally approving of the significant prison term, while juvenile justice advocates denounced it as effectively a life sentence for a child. Legal experts immediately began debating whether the sentence would withstand the inevitable appeals, with some arguing it violated the spirit, if not the letter, of Supreme Court rulings on juvenile sentencing, while others maintained that the parole eligibility after 30 years satisfied the constitutional requirement for a meaningful opportunity for release, as required by Miller v. Alabama. The case seemed destined to become a new battleground in the ongoing legal debate about juvenile culpability and appropriate punishment for the most serious crimes committed by the very young. As Cain was led from the courtroom following sentencing, reporters noted that for the first time since his arrest, his composed demeanor cracked slightly, with visible tears in his eyes as the reality of spending at least the next 30 years in confinement appeared to register. His grandmother called out, "I love you, Cain," as he passed, but he did not turn or respond, his small shoulders squared in what might have been either resignation or determination. Angela Wilson watched silently as her husband's killer was escorted away, then gathered her children close and led them from the courtroom, telling waiting reporters only, "We hope someday he understands what he's done. That's the beginning of justice for James." With these words, the formal legal proceedings in Commonwealth v. Jones concluded, but the case's impact on juvenile justice policy, law enforcement, and the broader conversation about children who commit adult crimes was only beginning to unfold. In the weeks following Cain Jones's sentencing, his case became a flashpoint in national debates about juvenile justice, prompting legislative hearings in multiple states and inspiring law review articles with titles like The Jones Paradox, Childhood, Culpability, and Punishment in the Modern Age. Legal scholars from across the ideological spectrum analyzed Judge Simmons's ruling, with conservative commentators generally praising the substantial sentence as appropriate recognition of the premeditated nature of Officer Wilson's murder, while progressive legal experts criticized the 110-year term as effectively a life sentence for a crime committed at age 12, regardless of the parole eligibility after 30 years. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court agreed to hear an expedited appeal filed by Morrison, who argued that the sentence violated both the letter and spirit of Miller v. Alabama and Montgomery v. Louisiana, setting the stage for what many anticipated would be a landmark ruling on the outer boundaries of juvenile sentencing for the most serious crimes. Media outlets continued to cover these developments extensively, with major networks producing documentary specials exploring the complex intersection of childhood development, criminal responsibility, and appropriate punishment highlighted by the Jones case. Cain himself began serving his sentence at Pennsylvania's Mid-Atlantic Juvenile Correctional Center, a specialized facility for serious juvenile offenders that offered intensive psychological treatment alongside educational programming. Initial reports from the center described him as a model resident who followed rules meticulously and excelled academically, particularly in mathematics and science, though counselors noted his continued emotional detachment and difficulty forming connections with peers or staff. The facility's lead psychologist, Dr. Maya Patel, implemented a specialized treatment protocol focused on developing empathy and emotional awareness, telling a juvenile justice conference, "Our goal with Cain is not just behavioral compliance, which he already demonstrates, but helping him develop the emotional and moral reasoning capacities that were severely underdeveloped at the time of his crime. She described his treatment as possibly the most challenging case of my 30-year career, noting that his combination of high intelligence, psychological detachment, and extreme youth created unprecedented challenges for rehabilitation protocols typically designed for older juvenile offenders with different psychological profiles. Officer James Wilson's legacy took shape through the foundation established in his name by his widow Angela, who channeled her grief into creating a program specifically designed to identify and provide intensive intervention for elementary school children showing early warning signs of severe behavioral and empathy disorders. The James Wilson Early Intervention Initiative partnered with Philadelphia Public Schools to train teachers in recognizing concerning behavioral patterns and provided funding for immediate psychological assessment and treatment for identified children, bypassing the long waiting lists and insurance barriers that had prevented Kane Jones from receiving appropriate intervention despite numerous warning signs observed by his teachers. At the initiative's launch, Angela told attendees, "If even one child receives the help they need before tragedy occurs, James's death will have created something meaningful alongside all the loss." The program quickly gained national attention as a model for early intervention, with several other major cities adopting similar frameworks, and federal legislation proposed to provide matching funds for communities implementing comparable programs. The Jones case also catalyzed significant reforms within Philadelphia's Department of Human Services, which had faced intense scrutiny for its failure to adequately follow up on multiple reports of concerning behavior from Kane, despite his family's long history with the agency. An independent review, commissioned by the mayor, identified systemic problems including overwhelming caseloads for social workers, insufficient training in recognizing psychopathic traits in children, and poor coordination between school counselors, mental health providers, and child welfare agencies. The resulting reforms included specialized training for all child welfare workers in identifying children with severe conduct disorders or callous unemotional traits, mandatory interagency case reviews for any child with multiple behavioral incident reports, and the creation of a specialized unit focused exclusively on high-risk youth, showing warning signs of potential violence. These changes, collectively known as the Wilson Protocols, were subsequently adopted by child welfare agencies in several other states, creating a lasting systemic impact that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of Kane's case. Philadelphia's law enforcement community honored Officer Wilson's memory through both symbolic gestures and substantive policy changes designed to build on his community policing philosophy. The Police Athletic League facility in Kensington, where Wilson had volunteered, was renamed in his honor and significantly expanded, with funding for additional programming focused on creating positive relationships between officers and at-risk youth. More significantly, Police Commissioner Garcia implemented mandatory training for all officers based on Wilson's approach to community engagement, with a particular emphasis on identifying and connecting with troubled children before they became entangled in the criminal justice system. James Wilson understood that the most effective crime prevention happens long before a law is broken, Garcia explained at a press conference, announcing the new training protocols. He saw potential in children others had written off, and our department will honor his legacy by embedding that philosophy in everything we do. Marcus Jones, Kane's older brother, received a 5-year sentence after pleading guilty to charges related to the illegal possession of the firearm used to kill Officer Wilson. During his sentencing hearing, he had broken down in tears, telling the court, "I never thought my little brother could do something like this. I should have seen the signs, should have told someone about the things he said about wanting to hurt police. I'll live with that guilt forever." Upon his release 3 years later, with time reduced for good behavior, Marcus became an unexpected advocate for gun safety and violence prevention, Speaking at schools about the importance of securing weapons and taking children's violent statements seriously rather than dismissing them as meaningless talk. His presentations, which candidly addressed his cognitive limitations and how they had contributed to his poor judgment regarding the firearm, resonated particularly with at-risk youth and became part of Philadelphia's expanded violence prevention curriculum in public schools. Cain's grandmother, Elaine Jones, who had been his primary caregiver in the years leading up to the murder, faced her own painful journey of reconciliation and responsibility in the aftermath of his sentencing. Initially ostracized in her Strawberry Mansion neighborhood and subjected to harassment by those who blamed her for failing to recognize and address Cain's dangerous tendencies, she eventually found purpose through participation in support groups for families of violent offenders. "I missed or ignored so many warning signs because I didn't want to believe my grandson could be capable of such violence," she admitted during a community forum on juvenile crime. "I was working 2 jobs, exhausted all the time, and when I did try to get help for Cain, the waiting lists were months long, and our insurance wouldn't cover the specialists he needed." Her honest acknowledgement of both systemic failures and personal blind spots resonated with many families struggling with troubled children, and she eventually became a volunteer parent advocate, helping other families navigate the complexities of accessing mental health services for children with severe behavioral issues. 3 years after Cain's sentencing, national attention returned to his case when PBS aired an acclaimed documentary titled The Youngest Murderer, featuring the first interviews with Cain himself from inside the juvenile correctional facility. The filmmaker, granted exceptional access through a court order justified on educational grounds, captured footage of Cain at 15 that showed both striking continuities and changes from the 12-year-old who had executed Officer Wilson. Now several inches taller and beginning to show signs of adolescence, Cain spoke with the same analytical precision about his crime, but demonstrated what his treatment team characterized as emerging, though still limited, capacity for emotional reflection. When asked if he felt remorse for killing Officer Wilson, he replied with what appeared to be carefully considered honesty. "I understand now that I took someone who mattered from the world and hurt many people who loved him. I don't feel it the way others might, but I know it was wrong in a way I didn't fully comprehend when I was 12. This nuanced response, suggesting intellectual growth without claiming emotional transformation that might not be genuine, sparked renewed debate about the rehabilitation potential for children with severe callous unemotional traits and the appropriate balance between punishment and treatment in such unusual cases. The most profound and lasting impact of the Jones case emerged in the legal sphere, where it ultimately reached the United States Supreme Court 5 years after the original sentencing. The court agreed to hear Morrison's appeal of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's split decision upholding Cain's sentence, setting the stage for a ruling that would clarify the constitutional boundaries for sentencing juvenile offenders. The resulting decision in Jones v. Pennsylvania established what became known as the extreme youth doctrine, holding that sentences for crimes committed by defendants under 14 must provide a realistic and substantial opportunity for release based on demonstrated rehabilitation, with specific consideration given to the defendant's chronological age at the time of the offense. While stopping short of categorically prohibiting very long sentences for the youngest offenders, the court ruled that Cain's parole eligibility after 30 years satisfied constitutional requirements, while acknowledging the unique moral complexity of cases involving preteen defendants who commit premeditated violent crimes. 10 years into his sentence, as Cain approached his 22nd birthday and prepared for transfer to an adult facility following a statutory review hearing, the Philadelphia Inquirer published an in-depth feature article revisiting the case that had transformed juvenile justice in Pennsylvania and beyond. The piece included interviews with Angela Wilson, who had remarried but continued to lead the foundation bearing her late husband's name, Dr. Maya Patel, who described Cain's progress as substantial but incomplete, noting his intellectual understanding of empathy had developed significantly, while his emotional capacity remained limited, and legal experts who pointed to 27 states that had revised their juvenile sentencing statutes in response to the Jones case and subsequent Supreme Court ruling. Perhaps most poignantly, the article featured excerpts from Cain's academic work, including an award-winning essay he had written for a prison education program titled Understanding What I Couldn't Feel, in which he analyzed his own psychological development with remarkable self-awareness. I committed my crime in a state of emotional blindness, able to see the physical actions, but completely unable to comprehend their human meaning. My ongoing punishment is that as my capacity for understanding grows, so too does my awareness of what I destroyed. Philadelphia itself had changed in the decade following Officer Wilson's murder, with the Kensington neighborhood where the shooting occurred undergoing significant revitalization, due in part to community policing initiatives inspired by Wilson's work. The intersection where he had been killed was marked by a small memorial plaque, often adorned with fresh flowers placed by officers patrolling the area, and the annual James Wilson Memorial 5K run raised funds for both his foundation and college scholarships for the children of fallen officers. The city's juvenile violent crime rate had declined by 27% since implementation of the early intervention program bearing Wilson's name, a statistic that juvenile justice experts attributed to the combination of improved identification of at-risk children and more accessible mental health services. This tangible positive change, emerging from the crucible of tragedy, represented what many viewed as the most meaningful legacy of the case, a community's determined effort to prevent future violence by addressing its root causes while never forgetting the human cost that had inspired such change. As Cain Jones continued serving his sentence, now an adult in chronological age, though forever defined by the actions of his 12-year-old self, legal scholars, psychologists, and ethicists continued to debate the fundamental questions raised by his case. How should society respond when a child commits an adult crime with apparent adult intent? Can a juvenile justice system designed primarily for rehabilitation adequately address the needs of victims and communities when the harm inflicted is irreversible and devastating? Is it possible to balance punishment, protection, and the potential for redemption when the offender's very youth suggests capacity for profound change while their actions demonstrate capacity for profound harm? The Jones case offered no simple answers to these questions, but it forced a national reckoning with their complexity and created frameworks for more nuanced approaches to juvenile justice that acknowledged both the mitigating reality of childhood development and the devastating consequences when childhood violence destroys adult lives. The enduring legacy of the case perhaps resided not in any single policy change or legal precedent, but in the way it complicated simplistic narratives about juvenile offenders, forcing recognition of the vast gray area between childhood innocence and adult culpability. Neither the most punitive approaches advocating adult consequences, regardless of age, nor the most rehabilitative approaches suggesting that youth alone should shield offenders from significant punishment could fully address the reality of a 12-year-old who had calculated and executed the murder of a police officer with clear intent and minimal remorse. The case demanded a more textured understanding of juvenile crime, one that could hold simultaneously the diminished culpability inherent in extreme youth and the genuine harm caused by deliberate violence. In navigating this difficult moral and legal territory, the justice system, like society itself, continued to seek that elusive balance between accountability and compassion, between punishment for what had been done and hope for what might yet be possible even in the aftermath of seemingly unforgivable acts.